Hi, and welcome back to Military Law Talks. So today's video is about the U.S. Supreme Court and how they act with haste in certain cases, but not with others. And so if you didn't catch my live stream about SCOTUS's midnight order or the part one or part two videos of that stream, I encourage you to watch those. This video might make a little bit more sense, but if you didn't watch those, it's okay. I will still explain this video. So this video actually is about a case that went all the way back to 2020, COVID time. So if you were living under a rock, maybe you don't remember, but for those of you, most of you do. So COVID happened in 2020. And if you're like me, maybe you're like, wow, that was like a really weird time. But yeah, so let's think back. So early 2020, so this is like spring of 2020. I remember hearing cases coming out of people getting sick, this like novel respiratory virus, and hearing all these terms that, social distancing, 6 feet, masking, all the stuff that I was like, what is going on? And I distinctly remember that I was at my parents' house and my mom read some headline and said, hey, in Washington state, the governor has declared essentially kind of like a stay-at-home order and said that there couldn't be large gatherings of people over like, I don't remember the number exactly, maybe 100 people or something like that. And I remember saying, that's ridiculous. That's blatantly unconstitutional, right? The US Constitution, the First Amendment, the most important amendment, part of the First Amendment says that the government shall not infringe on your right to assembly. The government can't stop you from getting together with other people. So immediately I was like, well, that's ridiculous. That'll be thrown out. No big deal. But much to my dismay, states started falling in line, and like dominoes, states started doing these stay-at-home orders or shutting down businesses or stopping churches from meeting. And it was shocking to me, how are these orders being upheld in the courts? How are they not being challenged? And so there specifically, right, different states started stopping in-person gatherings, particularly in churches. And that's another First Amendment violation. So not only do you have the First Amendment to gather into assembly, but you also have First Amendment. Well, I would argue your rights come from God, and the amendments just restrain the government from infringing on those rights, but that the government can't stop you from having this free exercise of your religion, and meeting in places of worship is part of that free exercise of religion. And so there was a case challenging Governor Newsom in California, his prohibitions on these in-person gatherings. And it was a case, it was called South Bay United Pentecostal Church versus Gavin Newsom. And on a temporary restraining order, it went up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And that temporary restraining order was denied by the U.S. Supreme Court. And so the reason I bring this up in relation to this midnight order case is to kind of compare and contrast the two. So the U.S. Supreme Court very recently, over Easter weekend, acted in such haste, issued, in my opinion, an unprecedented order in the middle of the night, leapfrogging the lower courts, telling the government not to do something, specifically not to deport designated terrorists from the country. And so the court issued this emergency order to stop the government from taking sort of action of deporting terrorists. But the Supreme Court never stepped in when state governors were violating people's First Amendment rights. Yeah. And the same Chief Justice Roberts, he's the one that issued this opinion. And so let me just share my screen. Okay, so this is Alito's dissent, Alito and Thomas's dissent from this midnight order stopping the government from deporting arguably terrorists from the country. And it talks about how it cites this case that was issued during the COVID pandemic. So it says members of this court has repeatedly insisted that an all writs act injunction pending appeal may only be granted when, among other things, the legal rights at issue are indisputably clear, and even then sparingly and only in the most critical exigent circumstances. It's quoting from that South Bay case. So think about that. So essentially, Chief Justice Roberts and the others who joined him in that opinion are saying that this planned deportation of arguably terrorists, but they're definitely, I think everyone would agree that they're in the country illegally, and that's why they're subject to deportation, is the most critical and exigent circumstances. But when it comes to ensuring that the government is not infringing on the First Amendment rights of its citizens, that is not a critical exigent circumstance. Yeah, let that sink in. Okay, so let's take a look at this opinion written by it's Chief Justice Roberts. So this is when they had the golden opportunity in May 2020 to stop these governors from essentially kind of banning church. And that's really what they did. They banned in-person gatherings, and the court had this monumental opportunity to ensure that they're protecting the rights of its citizens, the sacred First Amendment right of the free exercise of religion and assembly, and the court didn't. They refused to do it. So he talks about, hey, this is like a, it's an injunction, and the applicants are asking for this injunction, and like, hey, an injunction is like a higher burden than a stay, and this is like kind of a really big deal. This is what Roberts is saying. It says that, yeah, California's guidelines do place restrictions on places of worship. But it says, these restrictions are kind of consistent with the free exercise. Because, we're also restricting other sorts of secular gatherings, concerts, movie showings, sports, theaters, etc. So it's not discriminating against individuals. It's not treating anyone differently. And yeah, you can still go to Walmart and like big box stores, and there's no, limit on that. But, it's really not treating people differently. It's not really infringing on people's First Amendment rights. That's kind of what he's saying. And then more nefariously, we have what has been referred to as the super precedent of South Bay. And this portion that I'm going to read was cited by judges all over in 2020 and 2021 when any party challenged government COVID restrictions. They cited this South Bay opinion, and particularly this provision of it, to essentially rubber stamp government action and just be like, you know what, pandemic, emergency, Constitution doesn't really apply. We're going to throw out the Constitution, and we're just going to let government do whatever they want to do. And the courts are just kind of rubber stamp it, and we're not going to protect people's rights. And, we're not going to ensure that citizens have the free exercise of religion. We're just going to let them, the government stop and do whatever they got to do. So this is the super precedent. So it says, and I'm quoting from Chief Justice Roberts' opinion, our Constitution principally entrusts, quote, the safety and the health of the people, end quote, to the politically accountable officials of the states, quote, to guard and protect, citing Jacobson versus Massachusetts 1905 case. When these officials, quote, undertake to act in areas fraught with medical and scientific uncertainties, end quote, their latitude, quote, must be especially broad, citing a 1974 case. And I'm going to tell you why. So this was used all the time, like I said, to rubber stamp. And as someone who's read Jacobson, the 1905 case, I don't think any of the judges, including Roberts, actually read Jacobson, because Jacobson didn't just like rubber stamp government action. Jacobson is like a wholly different case. Number one, it wasn't dealing with the First Amendment. It was actually a forced smallpox vaccine. And if you didn't want to take the smallpox vaccine, all that would happen is that you would get a $5 fine, which in today's dollars is still, even with inflation, less than $200. So essentially kind of a nominal fine, not that big of a deal. Oh, and then you just continued life without being vaccinated, and it was totally fine. And it was brought under the 14th Amendment, not the First Amendment. And it's from 1905. And, courts have changed since then. Our ideas of like how the courts decide whether the government is infringing on particularly First Amendment. It has now what's called strict scrutiny. The government can only do it if it has a compelling government interest and does it in the least restrictive means. And that's a really, really high burden. And generally the government can't reach it. And so all these lower courts, and like I said, I'm walking around in 2020 thinking like, what is going on? Why aren't these courts finding these governor actions by these governors unconstitutional? It's blatantly unconstitutional. It's stopping people from worshiping. It is closing down churches. It's stopping people from protesting, which is a First Amendment right. And it all stems back to all these judges were quoting this case, Chief Justice Roberts. And so imagine how different life would be if judges wouldn't have followed this, if Roberts had actually like protected the Constitution and found Governor Newsom's bans that he put in place and all the other governors back in 2020, life would have been maybe different. Maybe we would have had a different outcome in the 2020 election. And maybe that's why it was done. And so this opinion wasn't righted until long after, until a year or two later. And so it wasn't righted until a case challenging Governor Cuomo, Andrew Cuomo, his restrictions on places of worship. And that was in, let me share my screen. This Supreme Court case, the Roman Catholic Diocese versus, and it was joined by Jewish members versus Governor Cuomo. And I am just gonna, so now it's saying, this case did grant a temporary restraining order. It did essentially kind of stop these really restrictive COVID restrictions. But I'm just going to quote from Neil Gorsuch's concurring opinion. So he says, quote, "The government is not free to disregard the First Amendment in times of crisis. At a minimum, the amendment prohibits government officials from treating religious exercises worse than comparable secular activities, unless they are pursuing a compelling interest in using the least restrictive means," right? They have to meet that strict scrutiny. Yet recently, during the COVID pandemic, certain states, blue states, seem to have ignored these long settled principles. And the courts just rubber stamped it based on Chief Justice Roberts' opinion. So he talks about how there was no restrictions on things like liquor stores and hardware stores and places to shop for a new bike, but there was significant restrictions on houses of worship. And so another quote from the opinion, the concurrence, "Nor is this problem an isolated one. In recent months, certain other governors have asserted similar edicts. At the flick of a pen, they have asserted the right to privilege restaurants, marijuana dispensaries, and casinos over churches, mosques, and temples." And so what could justify this radical departure from the First Amendment? Well, he talks about that South Bay concurrence, that this super precedent that was used by all these district court judges just to rubber stamp what these governors were doing. And so I'm quoting again, "Even if the Constitution has taken a holiday during this pandemic, sure seemed like it did, it cannot become a sabbatical. Rather than apply the non-binding and expired concurrence from South Bay, courts must resume applying the free exercise clause. Today, a majority of the court makes this plain. Not only did the South Bay concurrence address different circumstances than we now face, right? Because it was a little different order that was taking place by the governor. That opinion was mistaken from the start. I agree. To justify its results, the concurrence reached back 100 years in the U.S. reports to grab hold of our decision in Jacobson versus Massachusetts, but Jacobson hardly supports cutting the Constitution loose during a pandemic. That decision involved entirely different mode of analysis, entirely different right, and entirely different kind of restriction. And it goes on to talk about Jacobson. And so, yeah, it definitely felt like the Supreme Court just gave this license to lower courts and governors of all these states the ability, and red states too. I mean, Texas, I mean, horrifically, I remember this very early in the pandemic. Texas had people on the police on the border to stop people from Louisiana to try to come over to Texas. Yeah. So it happened in blue states and red states. All of them just trampled on and ignored the Constitution and just threw it out. And so it's just really rich and really interesting that the Supreme Court wants to yell about due process and constitutional rights for illegal terrorists. But where were they? Where were they when the constitutional rights of citizens were being trampled on? The Constitution was literally thrown away and forgotten during the COVID pandemic. And the Supreme Court was okay with it, rubber stamped it, blessed off on the governors, just absolutely eviscerating citizens in this entire country. It was very, very few states actually didn't have COVID restrictions. And where were they? They were nowhere to be. They were cowered in their homes, probably wearing their masks and totally okay with the government just absolutely, like I said, throwing out the Constitution, which no court ever pointed out that, hey, you know what? The Constitution was actually written during pandemics. We had lots of pandemics and outbreaks, and it was really common that lots of people died of diseases, and that was pretty commonplace when the Constitution was written. And so there's no constitutional exception there's no pandemic exception that hey, when we're having a pandemic, we're going to suspend the Constitution. That doesn't exist. But where was the Supreme Court when governors were violating people's constitutional rights, blatantly violating First Amendment rights? Nowhere to be found. But then all of a sudden, on midnight, on the most holy weekend in the Christian faith, they issue an order to the government without any sort of briefing, without the lower courts even making a decision to say, hey, stop the government, stop deporting illegals, illegal terrorists, illegal gang members. Yeah. Supreme Court's got their priorities totally messed up. All right, that's the end of my rant. Sorry, it was a lot longer rant than I expected. All right, if you like this content, please hit the thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so and share this video out there. I'm a new channel, help me grow. If you like this content, put some comments below that helps with the algorithms. And if you have any ideas for future content, leave those below as well. Thanks for tuning in.